The world's biggest organization of developing countries calls for global financial reform. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu and this is The Heat. Leaders from the Group of 77 plus China agreed to move forward as a bloc to promote South-South cooperation, solidarity, and a fairer global system for developing countries. More than 130 member states plus China took part in the third South Summit in the Ugandan capital Kampala over the weekend. CGTN's Nick Mudimba has more in this report.
The G77 plus China summit came to a close on Monday with calls for unity among the more than 130 member states. China's commitment in the South-South cooperation was cemented by an emphatic assurance of unwavering support.
China has always worked with the South countries to uphold international justice and equity and defend our common rights and interests in development, setting up a shining example of equality and sincere mutual assistance among the countries of the South, and blazing a broad path towards common development. Last month, China held the Central Conference on work relating to foreign affairs. This meeting is quite important, of quite relevance here, because the meeting has clearly pointed out that building a community with a shared future for mankind is the noble goal pursued by China.
The member states agreed on key principles to ensure sustainable prosperity. These include consistency in production of goods and services, trade, and improved infrastructure.
But this assumes that we have peace among ourselves, which is another issue. Because if we don't have peace, then we shall not achieve this. So I would have to be in touch with some of the brothers and sisters who have got tensions or even conflict, to see how win-win solutions can be found.
The G77 plus China summit also ignited an impetus for its members to band together at the United Nations. But how will they do that?
In more than 50 years, the UN has never seen reform. This is an opportunity. And the Group of 77 and China will be at the center of those negotiations. We are talking about sustainable development, international peace and security, digital compact, youth. We're going to really be at the center of it. We will use our number to negotiate hard for the interests of developing countries.
Tough immigration policies and visa restrictions were also part of key discussions with member states, as well as easing business barriers.
The most important thing is for us to be united and to expand cooperation with our border. Expand as many sectors as possible. And of course, economic, trade, socioculture, and people-to-people contact would be important factor for the advancements of South-South cooperation.
Heads of states and government are upbeat about the numbers they have, even as the summit of the future awaits in September, assuring them of a bargaining power. Countries in the G77 are leaving Uganda with their heads high after a resolution that will hopefully bring prosperity and affluence in the coming month. But all eyes will now be centered in the summit of the future. Nick Mudimba, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Sourabh Gupta is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Sergio Lima is a senior Brazil analyst with Medley Advisors, a political risk consulting firm. Also with us is Joseph Ochieno. He is an African affairs writer and commentator. And Victor Gao is a chair professor at Soochow University. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Victor, the G77 is the world's biggest organization of developing countries. They represent something like 80% of the world's population. Now, China is not an official member, but it does support the mission of the organization. How big a role can the G77 play on the world stage?
Thank you very much for having me. G77 in itself is a little bit of a misnomer because the total membership is way beyond the 77 countries who originally formed the organization. Indeed, the membership more or less overlapped with what we call the Global South, the developing countries, or the developed world, or, as I used to before, the third world, as we used to say. Now, China's relations with the G77 organization is crucially important. China always considers itself as a developing country, even though sometimes developed countries will put the label of developed countries onto China. But I think from China's perspective, as a national strategy, China feels a lot of bond and affinity and camaraderie with all the developing countries in the world. Therefore, this solidarity between China on the one hand and all the members of the G77 group is crucially important and will become more and more important in the coming years and decades. Now, the G77 plus China will really do a much better job in rallying the forces for the Global South or for all the developing countries in the world, focusing on several key things. The infrastructure connectivity, financial connectivity, technological connectivity, and a focus on bringing manufacturing jobs to many developing countries, uplifting the living standards of the people in the developing countries, and always putting a premium on peace, stability, and growth as the top priorities of every government in the developing world. This is exactly what China has been doing over the past 45 years, achieving huge transformation for itself, as well as pulling the global economy in the right way of direction, adding about 30 to 35% of the additional GDP growth of the world economy every year. And I think the close cooperation between China and G77 members will generate similar miracles in the coming years and decades, making sure that the developing countries will really have a better roadmap of economic development, uplifting their people out of poverty, building up infrastructure, and putting a premium on developing manufactured sectors for all these developing countries.
Now, Victor, the Chinese Vice Premier Liu Guoxiong, he was in Kampala for this summit. This is some of what he told delegates there. Let's watch.
The world's changes of the century are happening with acceleration. The collective rise of countries of the South is unstoppable. At the same time, the influence of the unfair and unreasonable old international economic and political order remains. We should jointly advocate for equal and orderly world multipolarity and inclusive economic globalization, build an open economy, firmly promote trade and investment liberalization and facilitation, resolutely oppose anti-globalization and overstretching of security concept, and create an international environment conducive to the development of countries of the South.
So, Victor, how can the countries of the South exercise their collective influence and push for reform?
Well, there are several ways to do that. One is to really become increasingly aware of the might and the size and the impact of the Global South, or the G77 with all its members plus China, can bring onto the table. Secondly, I think the Chinese leader in Kampala said the right thing. The current international order, either in the political sector or in the economic sector, financial sector, etc., do need to be further reformed, taking into the vast amount of people represented by G group of 77 and China, as well as the inequalities in the political order, economic order, and financial order that we are living with. And in this way, the better way is to increase our voices, to become more as an advocate for the legitimate interests of the people in the G77 plus China. And also, we really need to demonstrate to the satisfaction of everyone in the world that we, in the Global South, among the membership of the G77 plus China, we actually can achieve our goals because we have the enough wisdom, resources, courage, and vision to do the right thing, to chart a growth path suitable for our circumstances, according to the circumstances of each of the G77 countries, and the development should not be the monopoly of the developed world. And no one in the world should claim to have a monopoly of the truth. And therefore, the G77 member states plus China will have equal justification to pursue growth paths of our own choice rather than on terms dictated by the developed countries. The world going forward will be truly a multipolar world, reflecting the legitimate interests of all the developing countries, most of which are members of the G77 organization plus China. And I think this will really make economic development going forward truly more meaningful and more significant, because it will reflect the legitimate interests of all the people in the membership of the group of 77 plus China.
Joseph Ochieno, Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni, he addressed the gathering. He emphasized the importance of global financial institutions and the assistance they can offer. But very often, of course, this assistance comes with conditions attached to it. He wants to see that being reformed. Can it be done?
I think that is one of the biggest challenges facing the organization. Whether or not they can speak in one voice and with one voice, with the leadership provided in this case by whoever, is it going to be the chairman? I would suggest on this occasion, it's actually very exciting times with the new and apparent challenge of the current global order, particularly financial order, with the emergence of BRICS in recent times, and with the reality that aspects of global dominance of global power is unsustainable, and especially that they can no longer morally spread, a particular, a singular narrative. I think time is possibly about now to have a very urgent review of this arrangement, and I suspect that the next 2 to 3 years is going to be very, very interesting, depending on what kind of leadership is provided for this. I think the biggest challenge actually facing the G77 plus China, and indeed many of these other South-South organizations, are really implementations of declarations that will have emerged, like the one that emerged out of Kampala today. If really these countries came together, and I think Mr. Museveni seemed to have suggested that, if countries came together and spoke with one voice, and particularly if they went to the UN, both General Assembly, and influenced the permanent members, including members of the Security Council, and focused their programs as resolved, say today, taking it to Washington and sticking with it, actually, so particularly into New York, there is no reason why these things cannot happen. I think it is no longer a question of monopoly of financial systems in the global north, as my colleague already said much earlier. I think all that is also now needed is urgent citizenship participation, meaning citizens at democratic levels, from the grassroots to the highest echelons of nation states, and collectively, that we simply speak that actually global financial system cannot be maintained as the way it is, and generally and urgently needs to be changed. The Bretton Woods institutions, as it were, I think really now they're highly in a questionable state. What China did in the last 45 years has shown that it's actually possible, with the leadership and clarity and purpose and focus and a sense of independence, that it can actually transform the world. And I totally agree that actually if we did that, there's no reason why possibly the next 10 or so years does not see a completely different global order, in this case in the financial systems, but also generally politically.
Sourabh Gupta, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, he advised developing countries to exercise their rights and negotiate clear positions with developed countries. Let's listen.
While South-South cooperation is strong and deepening, it does not replace the need for the respect of the commitment of the global north, for sustained engagement to reduce poverty and inequality, support growth, and build resilience in developing countries. Digital technologies have enormous potential for good, but they are also inflaming inequalities. The International Monetary Fund warns that artificial intelligence could make things even worse. And peace, the foundation of sustainable development, is breaking down amidst a climate of global impunity.
So Sourabh, Guterres also pointed out that the countries that benefit most from the current system are unlikely to push for reform, and that change must come from within developing nations. What are your thoughts on that?
I think he was absolutely spot on in what he said. What the G77 and China have is strength in numbers. The point is about how to translate that strength in numbers into coherent negotiating strategies. He is correct to say that the global north is just not going to cede away what it has, and the global south at some level will need to price that from the global north, price that away. And to do that, there needs to be coherent negotiating strategies put forward. What often happens at groupings like the G77 plus China is that they're represented by diplomats. There are a lot of generalists in the room. There are not issue matter specialists out there, and they can't really push back or champion their cause as coherently as they should. Also, as President Museveni noted, there are certain countries which have within the global south which have conflicts with each other. But even if we don't go as far as say conflicts, there are countries, some are oil importing countries, they're oil exporting countries, they're food importing countries, they're food exporting countries. Their interests are heterogeneous within the G77. So it's important that they sit down and have those coherent negotiating strategies, because when they do come with those coherent strategies, the global north listens to them. And if those strategies have life, the global north is willing to concede space and try to have a more equitable bargain. We saw that with what is called the Bridgetown Initiative in terms of how there can be greater financing for many of these developing countries. It had traction. It came out from Barbados. And so I think the point needs to be well taken that Secretary General Gutierrez is mentioning, that yes, there is strength in numbers. It's important to translate that into strategies and don't be captive to extremist interests or vested interests within this grouping, but try to have a broad consensus with which one can negotiate with the global north.
Right, and Sourabh, on the question of the reform of global institutions, the UN Secretary General said the United Nations Security Council is paralyzed by geopolitical divisions and its composition does not reflect the reality of today's world. It must be reformed.
Yes, it must. Yes, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, he's absolutely correct. It must be reformed, but one must also understand reform reform will not come easily, and it will take a while to get it done, and that should not hold up the process of coming up with ideas how to go about reforming, how to have, as I said, those coherent negotiating strategies. Let me just take you back 100 years ago. It was World War I had ended, and there was talk of having a new financial order, and there was a conference in Genoa in 1922 to set up a new international framework. And there were a lot of good ideas out there. None of them really were translated into action, but those good ideas, little by little incrementally came together. And when the system was rewritten in 1945, many of those ideas, which were non-American ideas, were championed by the US president, and they came together in what we have, the UN system and the Bretton Woods system. And so, yes, reform will not happen immediately, but that shouldn't hold back developing countries coming up with coherent ideas, good ideas, which benefit them and benefit the system at large.
Mario, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. The United Nations Secretary General also said that many G77 members are grappling with the economic fallout from the COVID pandemic. There's crippling debt, there's a cost of living crisis as well, and we've seen how borrowing costs have increased very quickly. What is your assessment of the situation in Latin America?
Well, Latin America can actually be seen as a success story, especially in the last year. I mean, the countries here, we had an increase of rates that was very fast after to fight inflation. But if you take Argentina and Venezuela aside, you can see that inflation, especially in the bigger economies outside of those, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, we actually had, they are in different stages, of course, but we have seen this inflation coming. And this inflation happened, especially in a moment where we had a pretty good year in terms of economic expansion for those countries. Brazil was very lucky to have a very good crop season, which agriculture really helped a lot Brazil. Latin America was actually we were little trailblazing in that sense, moving forward after the pandemic. But as you mentioned, there are some issues that need to be tackled. Brazil has a very difficult fiscal situation. We need to remain in the route of fiscal consolidation, and this will probably mean a lot of difficulties in terms of providing and fighting inequality, which is one of the main goals of this current government.
Mario, during the G77 plus China summit that was held in Havana in Cuba last September, President Lula of Brazil said the G77 was fundamental to, and I'm quoting him here, denounce the anomalies of world trade and to defend the construction of a new international economic order. He also criticized the World Trade Organization and the Bretton Woods system. Where do you see the disconnect between these institutions that have been around for a very long time and the reality on the ground right now?
I mean, you have to remember that Brazil and the other countries here in Latin America, they're still struggling with high poverty levels, very high inequality levels, which were only, although Brazil was somewhat successful in reducing extreme poverty amid a lot of helicopter money during the pandemic, inequality has risen. So it is a worry. And Lula, he has been very vocal into that. Lula, we have now a Brazilian president now is very much, he really wants to strengthen the whole South cooperation. He wants to distance himself from what would be perceived as a very Washington-centered policy, which was established by the former president, Jair Bolsonaro. But it's a balancing act. Brazil cannot, Brazil wants to fulfill this regional leadership, it has to have like one foot in each boat. So it really needs the cooperation from the South in terms of economic and not just in terms of ideology, which I think ideologically, Brazil now, Brazil's government's way more connected to the South-South plight. But Brazil needs to, when it's focusing on its own interest, you need to have this balancing act with the U.S., which is always a difficult situation, and it has been made even more difficult now with Argentina's new president, which has a way more different approach and really wants to put Argentina more in line to the West rather than the developing economies.
Victor, there have been calls for major reform of institutions like the World Bank, like the International Monetary Fund. Now, China has taken the initiative. We've seen China behind the establishment of the New Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the Silk Road Fund. To what extent does that level the playing field, in a sense?
Well, first of all, China does not want to rock the boat as far as the existing international order is concerned. China just believes that the international order that we are living in has profound problems which need to be further improved. That means the system, which was more or less set up around 1945 or in its immediate aftermath, were more or less reflecting the realities on the ground back several decades ago. But it does not reflect the realities on the ground today, because you have tremendous amount of growth in many different parts of the world. And the world today is very, very different from the world in 1945. So the system, whatever you call it or define it, need to be readjusted to take into consideration the profound, tremendous amount of changes that have already taken place. And what China has been doing in terms of setting up the BRIC framework together with other partners, setting up the New Development Bank, the AIIB, you name it, are a series of attempts to make sure that the international order will be reformed and reflecting the changes. And these changes are not revolutionary changes, try to turn the existing system upside down. No, they are designed to make sure that the existing defects and shortcomings in the international order, be it political or economic or financial, will need to be amended and improved to reflect the realities on the ground. In that sense, I think China is very much a very cautious advocate of reforms rather than a very rash advocate of revolution of any kind, because we believe that the existing international order, be it having a lot of defects and problems, still can be reformed, and it's much better if it is reformed to reflect the realities on the ground more accurately than, for example, throwing everything out of the window and start anew, because that will cause a lot of opportunities cost, and it may not be very much in the fundamental interest of the countries who are members of the G77 plus China.
Joseph, President Museveni also told the gathering, quoting him here again, "I wonder why global economic actors fail to understand that the prosperity of the entire world population benefits everyone instead of opting for policies that keep the majority in power." Of course, this is a very fundamental question. In some ways, it's a philosophical question, because the rich will always act in their own interest to protect their own interests. How challenging is it going to be to change that mindset?
I think our colleague who's just spoken has seemingly suggested that, but possibly in nuances. That has always been the realities. And of course, hearing the conversations about the realities of what may be happening in Brazil, you're absolutely right. I have experience of living and working with colleagues and friends, and including residing in the global north, and that's part of the reality. So that even within amongst the very rich of the rich in the societies, most even in the south, you know, the imperativeness of inequality is such that when you talk about inequality, you talk about injustice, it's almost apparently like them versus us. But that is actually not the point, and that is why the group of 77 plus China is an extremely important organization that will say, in the likely event that these guys came together and focused together, it would be radical, not in an extremist view, you know, a fundamental change that the world actually needs. It's absolutely imperative that what China did, and China used to be criticized grossly in the last 5 or so 10 years ago, when they're actually working to reform and reorganize and uplift the majority of their citizens out of poverty. Right. Once upon a time, it was almost like a joke, like fun, particularly from friends in the global north. But the reality today is that China is making a net contribution into the new global order with provision of leadership and actually evidence that alternative economic arrangements can actually work. Yeah. So really all that is required is for our colleagues in the global north, just like our neighbors, if our neighbors know and feel that we have conflict at home, that is actually in the best interest that we don't have conflict. Okay. No, it's almost a commonsensical imperative that actually the better we do in the global south, the better really it will be for everybody else, both global south and global north, and it should not be either or.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.